When you picture gingerbread, you're almost certainly picturing a crisp, baked cookie cut into a very recognizable shape. But for over 500 years, the thing people actually knew as gingerbread never went near an oven, and it wasn't a cookie. Look closely at the oldest English instructions, and you find a strange detail. Half of the original recipes didn't require a single scrap of ginger. The name survived for centuries, but the recipe itself was essentially erased. To understand how a chewy brick of honey became the frosted man on a holiday plate, we have to go into the kitchen and bring an extinct candy back to life. In the 1300s, if an English person asked for gingerbread, they simply meant preserved ginger root. The word comes from the Old French gingerbread, which traces back to the Latin zingiber. It was candied spice, put up like fruit. It took until roughly the 15th century for the word to slide sideways and attach itself to a specific, structured confection. We have the exact instructions in a collection that scholars call two 15th century cookery books, edited by Thomas Austin. Reading Middle English requires some patience, but the instructions are precise. You are told to take a quart of honey, seethe it, and skim it clean. Then you throw on saffron, some powdered black pepper, and grated stale bread. The cook is instructed to work those breadcrumbs into the hot honey until it becomes chargient. It's an old culinary term that means heavy or laden. Reading an ingredient list of stale bread and black pepper only gets you so far. To understand why someone would make this, you have to actually cook it. Saffron, cinnamon, pepper, sometimes cloves. Today you can grab every one of those off a supermarket shelf with pocket change. In the 14th century, compiling that specific list of ingredients meant you had access to the far reaches of global trade networks. These were the ultimate luxury goods. To put their exclusivity in perspective, look at the relative market cost. At certain moments, 1 pound of ginger root could fetch the exact price of a living sheep. These spices traveled thousands of miles from Asia and Africa, passing through dozens of hands, multiplying the cost before reaching an English kitchen. When a wealthy household prepared this recipe, they were grating up a literal brick of money to eat for pleasure. The process begins by boiling a full quart of honey in a heavy pan. You skim the pale foam off the top as it rises, exactly like skimming a stock, until the liquid runs completely clear and gold. Then comes the strange physical phase change of the recipe. You add the stale breadcrumbs, handful after handful. The hot honey drinks them up until the entire mass seizes. It stops behaving like a liquid and drags into a dense, heavy paste. You press it flat into a tray, dust the top with cinnamon, and slice it into squares. For garnish, medieval cooks pinned glossy box leaves to the top with a whole clove. Box is actually a toxic decorative plant, so those leaves were purely an aesthetic crown, never meant to be eaten. Eventually, cooks realized this thick paste held its shape perfectly, pressing it into carved wooden molds to dry into decorative figures. Legend says Queen Elizabeth I used molds like these to serve edible portraits of visiting dignitaries, handing guests figures of themselves. Between the personalized figures at court and the tokens given at festivals, this dense paste allowed cooks to turn expensive spices into a specific, humanized gift. This is likely how the gingerbread man began, as a way to turn wealth into a symbol. When you taste the finished square, the texture hits first. There is no flour to soften it, and no butter to round it out. It is intense, pure honey held together by bread, clinging to the teeth like a very firm caramel. Then, a beat later, you get the secondary profile. The black pepper delivers a warm, prickling heat right at the back of the throat. It is an entirely unexpected sensation from something that looks like candy. That heat was highly intentional. Tudor medical philosophy held that heavy spices warmed the body, and eating a dense, spice-loaded morsel like this was believed to settle the stomach and aid digestion after a massive meal. That is why it belonged to what they called the banquetting stuff, the spread of sugary delicacies brought out at the very end of a grand feast, often served in an entirely separate room. This recipe functioned as both a display of financial status and a practical medical finish to a heavy meal. For roughly 300 years, the boiled honey and breadcrumb method was the absolute standard. But by 1663, when Robert May published his massive culinary guide, The Accomplished Cook, the old recipe had practically vanished from the pages. Cooks made two massive ingredient substitutions that changed the dish. They replaced the grated bread with wheat flour, and they dropped the ancient honey in favor of molasses and treacle. Molasses and treacle were the cheap byproducts of the booming 17th century global sugar trade. Sugar democratized sweet ingredients, driving honey out of the kitchen. Replacing bread with flour changed the chemistry of the mixture. The paste became a batter, capable of holding air and rising in an oven to become the cake or crisp cookie we recognize today. The modern holiday cookie essentially erased its own ancestor, but the original peppered brick of money is still sitting right there in the historical record, waiting for anyone curious enough to boil it. If you enjoyed this trip through the archives, consider subscribing to the channel, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a strange historical dish from your own family's history that you've always wondered about? Drop it down below, and I'll see you in the next one.